By the winter of 1942, the Desert War had become a contest of dust, distance, and improvisation, and nothing captured that truth more starkly than a single captured Willys MB Jeep parked like contraband behind a German supply tent near the Gulf of Sirte. It did not arrive by requisition or rail manifest. It arrived by rumor, barter, and risk, traded along back channels that began at a burned-out British column and ended with a grease-stained handshake between a Wehrmacht sergeant and a Bedouin fixer who knew where fuel, water, and steel wandered when maps failed. This is the micro-history of a black market that fed on scarcity and speed, an invisible economy that converted captured American simplicity into German mobility, one standardized bolt at a time. In that environment, the Willys MB wasn't just a vehicle, it was a philosophy of war in metal, flathead, Go Devil engine, 134 cubic inches, roughly 60 horsepower, engineered to be repaired anywhere by anyone with the right wrench and a minute to spare, where German maintenance manuals multiplied with variants, the Jeep simplified with standardization, making cannibalization not a desperate measure but an intended design pathway for mass armies moving fast. A captured Jeep arrived with a cultural payload. It said that victory didn't belong to the cleverest part, but to the parts that any hand could reach without cursing. The Afrika Korps had already earned a reputation for employing Beutefahrzeuge, captured vehicles, whenever the front collapsed and reassembled like windblown sand, but the Jeep accelerated that habit into a system. It bridged gaps that German tables of equipment didn't anticipate, carrying dispatchers, medics, officers, and spare belts across wadis where maps grew vague and logistics lagged. The Jeep's four-wheel drive and torque made dunes negotiable and retreats survivable, which meant every commander who tasted its utility wanted one more and then another, whether Berlin authorized it or not. Unseen in dispatches, a web formed, mechanics who swapped parts for cigarettes, quartermasters who overlooked numbers that balanced themselves, Italian drivers who knew a man in Tripoli who knew a boy in Sfax who could find a T-84 gearbox under a tarp. This was not organized crime in the cinematic sense. It was survival economics, where oil-caked ledgers tracked favors and bearings and the price of a working condenser after a haboob. In a theater where fuel shortages and overextended supply lines made doctrine academic, the Jeep's maintainability became currency, and currency always finds a market. The drama of this story lies in that market's shadows, code words muttered at dusk, a hood raised to signal trust, a Kübelwagen idling nearby like a proud cousin, with different bones and different luck. Germany's Type 82 Kübelwagen was light, efficient, and clever, but it carried two-wheel drive and roughly 25 horsepower into a world that increasingly demanded the Jeep's brute, forgiving traction. So the black market specialized in heresy, putting American hearts into German hands and using the enemy's simplicity to outrun the desert's patience. The first network node was always a mechanic, not a merchant, because the desert decided value by what could start and move before dawn. When a reconnaissance unit found a drivable Jeep near a shattered British lager, the senior wrench turned instinctively to the hood latches, and what he found changed his trade. Color-coded wires, standardized fasteners, and components arranged as if someone had asked the mechanic, not the engineer, how the war would be fought. He timed a plug swap with a cigarette, then a fan belt change with a canteen sip, discovering that maintenance time was a strategic parameter, not an afterthought. From that moment, spare parts became favors, and favors became routes. A shock absorber traveled in a bread crate, a condenser lived inside a boot, wrapped in cloth, carried by an Italian radio operator whose cousin serviced taxis in Benghazi. If a Jeep arrived missing a transfer case, a ledger produced one by sunset, and the cost was measured in cigarettes, fuel, or the promise of a ride when the next raid went bad. Mechanics learned the Jeep's language: T84, gearbox, Dana, 18 transfer case, 6-volt electrics, Carter carburetor, L-head quirks like heat soak, and choke manners in cool desert nights. None of this was mystical. It was discoverable at speed because the architecture was unpretentious, with clear access and minimal special tools, reducing downtime in ways that multiplied combat reach. Where a German workshop might pause for a part number and a specialist, a Jeep encouraged improvisation that still respected the design, a paradox that felt like permission. To keep this machine moving under German colors, nomenclature adapted, Beutefahrzeug Jeep entered whispered inventories, and pencil margins recorded USA läuft gut next to odometer readings that lied optimistically. Captured vehicle lists had long existed for tanks and lorries, but now petty logbooks in motor pools grew their own annexes tracking fuel filters, axle seals, and the rare luxury of a new set of ND tread tires. The desert showed no mercy to rubber, and a Jeep without shoes was a promise broken. So tire trades commanded premium prices in the barter bazaar. The network's ethics were pragmatic. If an Italian column needed an alternator for a staff car and a German patrol needed a Jeep's rotor arm, someone with a grease pencil decided equivalence, and the exchange happened in a no-man's land behind a field kitchen. Rommel's supply headaches were legendary, and while official channels strained for petrol and ammo, unofficial ones scavenged the small reliabilities that kept reconnaissance alive. The Kübelwagen was not an enemy to be mocked. It was a cousin, shaped by a different promise, light enough to be pushed by 2 soldiers, and clever enough to float over sand where mass punished ambition. It rode well, sipped fuel, and favored comfort over torque, a set of virtues that made sense in a doctrine that prized specialization and economy. But when a wadi turned to a corrugated climb and the night chase demanded traction at the worst angle, the Jeep's transfer case locked the argument with a clunk. That functional contrast produced a market logic. German units without 4-wheel drive, light vehicles coveted Jeeps for patrols, liaison runs, and casualty evacuation, tasks where minutes mattered and failure stranded men, not plans. "Give us 1 Jeep," a lieutenant told a fixer, "and you can have 3 wine brand and a promise," which, in the economy of trust, equaled a usable clutch assembly. 2 weeks later, every captured Jeep became 3, 1 to drive, 1 to strip, 1 to dream about. When the first 2 broke, cannibalization was not wasteful in this logic. It was the math of survival, turning a dead vehicle into a dozen revivals, each spare part accounting for an escape from a stuck gully. Standardization made this calculus work because the Jeep's bolts, belts, and bearings spoke a common language across thousands of copies built for interchangeability. Numbers whispered through the ranks, hundreds of thousands of Jeeps rolling off American lines, a scale that made the idea of spare feel embedded in the metal. German soldiers, who pried open hoods, read the proof in practical terms. If one water pump fit this engine, it would fit the next, and the next after that, which made every wreck a future promise. Thus, the black market behaved like a shadow supply chain, mapping the desert with routes defined by where a Jeep had died yesterday. Terminology from Homefront and field manuals, Beutefahrzeug, war booty, captured equipment, met the desert's vernacular of what runs now, and the old words lost their moral weight. Our officers were not blind. Some sanctioned it tacitly, reasoning that mobility was its own argument in a theater where doctrine dehydrated quickly. The better ones sent their mechanics first and their reports later, trusting affidavits to follow where tires already had. Development Part 3. The market's brokers were often local men who understood that a convoy was a moving marketplace and that every column shed hardware like seeds. They navigated by reputation and campfire gossip, turning derelict vehicles into inventories and inventories into favors, calling out part numbers in 3 languages and hand signs. A set of points might cost 2 tins of bully beef, or 1 ride to a well at midnight, or a silence about which unit was seen where. Italian motor pools served as informal exchanges, not because of policy, but because of permeability, a porosity of oversight that made room for practical men to make deals. British dumps, after a failed push, left maintainers with armfuls of hoses and clamps, and a clever broker knew which German patrol desperately needed a radiator cap before the next dust-off. The bartering medium varied: cigarettes, schnapps, clean water, but the preferred payment was often reciprocal access, a promise that when the tables turned, a different hand would lift a hood without questions. The Jeep's technical virtues simplified this commerce. Its L134 Go Devil was tolerant of indifferent maintenance and dusty air, and mechanics learned to adjust timing by ear in crosswinds that stole their voices. The Carter carburetor forgave a clumsy hand if the float level was honest, and the 6-volt system, Spartan but sufficient, kept spark alive so long as cables were tight and faith was tighter. Kübelwagens, by contrast, entered this exchange differently, asking for fewer parts but offering less when the going turned vertical. Their 2-wheel drive, a political fact in dunes that respected only torque. Their air-cooled simplicity won admirers in heat that bullied radiators, but when weight and gradient conspired, they ceded the trail to Jeeps that crawled where they coasted. This comparative truth fueled the market's bias. If a raid was planned and silence mattered, the Jeep's broader performance envelope fetched a higher price and a longer line. Over time, a lexicon formed in workshops built of canvas and faith. Good spark runs cold at dusk. No second gear, 2 teeth missing. Phrases that mapped machines to risks in the way sailors read waves. Mechanics rated components by reliability under grit. How long a fan belt lasted after a sandstorm. Which brands of plugs fouled least. Which gaskets wept and which swore. These judgments traveled faster than orders because a running vehicle outranked a stamped form in any language the desert recognized. As 1943 wore on, the black market professionalized without admitting it, adopting rhythms, couriers, and buffer zones where trades could occur with plausible deniability. A route might begin with a scout observing an abandoned depot, continue with a local crew stripping usable parts before the sun punished the unwise, and finish with a German sergeant weighing risk against need by lantern light. The currency of trust densified: deliver once and the next delivery cost less, fail once, and your name became a word that closed doors. Meanwhile, institutional Germany acknowledged the ubiquity of captured vehicles in broad categories: lists, manuals, field notes, implicitly blessing what it could not forbid by the simple act of documenting it. Afrika Korps habitually relied on captured gear when shortages peaked, a practice that mirrored years of German adaptation across fronts, now accelerated by an enemy whose production flooded battlefields with interchangeable parts. In this ocean of availability, the Jeep stood out not merely for numbers, but for downstream effects. Faster maintenance meant longer patrols. Longer patrols meant better intelligence. Better intelligence meant survivability, and survivability paid back the market's risks. The technical script of these swaps hardened into checklists. Before any trade, mechanics inspected the Jeep's T-84 for chip dogs, spun the drive shaft to feel for backlash, checked the Dana 18 for oil, the color of secrets, and shook the kingpins like doctors gauging pulse. They evaluated wiring by smell, fuel by cloudiness, and compression by thumb, marking good enough when perfect would have meant walking. Failures wrote their own addenda. When a head gasket surrendered under a noon climb, men recorded ambient, load, and grade, not to file a report, but to memorize the recipe of disaster so the next trade set and expectations correctly. If a condenser failed in a sand-laden sirocco, the lesson was to carry spares in oiled cloth and to keep points bright enough to reflect conscience. Against this practical scripture, the Kübelwagen retained a role, a courier, light utility, steady rider, while the Jeep took on missions that flirted with stupidity and survived often enough to make the risk addictive. Allies had designed it to be a generalist, and German users, even grudging ones, learned that in the desert, generalists outlived specialists because the terrain refused to honor job descriptions. Thus, a captured American design became a German habit, and the habit became a shadow doctrine with an accounting ledger that never reached Berlin. Stories from unit diaries, some official, some apocryphal, describe officers who began meetings by asking, "Who has a running Jeep?" as if asking, "Who had a plan?" When a patrol did not return by dawn, the first response was to prepare a Jeep to fetch men home, a reflex that said more about the vehicle's reputation than any speech could. Mechanics, elevated by necessity, became kingmakers whose signatures were not ink but spark. Black markets thrive on risk differentials, and the desert exaggerated every margin. Heat punished delay, distance punished error, enemy patrols punished greed. Yet for all the peril, the returns were irresistible because they translated directly into miles and hours, the twin currencies of reconnaissance and retreat. A well-timed swap could add a day to an operations reach, a day that might mean the difference between an encirclement and a story told over bad coffee. With each successful trade, the market learned to disguise itself better. Receipts became riddles, manifests became rumors, and a supply tent that smelled strongly of gasoline in the morning smelled strongly of soap by evening. Some officers disapproved on principle, but principles grew tired when wheels spun free after a night of shovels and swears, and disapproval softened into the silence of gratitude. Post-war, historians would emphasize production numbers and grand logistics, and they are right to do so. But the texture of victory and defeat also lived here, and in how quickly a man could reach a distributor cap in darkness and make a spark return. Captured equipment as a category gets treated like a footnote. Yet, in the Western Desert, it regularly decided whether information arrived on time, and information is the most lethal ammunition in a war of maneuver. The Jeep's maintainability amplified this effect because it transformed scavenging from a gamble into a workflow. That workflow trained hands, German mechanics who spent months keeping Beuter Jeeps alive, learned habits they would carry into peacetime: design for access, respect the standard fastener, prioritize time to repair, and treat the next user as a stranger who deserves a fair chance. The war ended, the market dissolved, but the lessons stuck to palms like oil that never fully washed away. Even at the black market's peak, no one would have called it a system, yet its behavior was systemic. Inputs, transformations, outputs, feedback loops in grease and whispers. It was lean before the word, agile before the manifesto, and its core metric was cruelly simple. Does it run now? And will it still run after the next ridge? In that metric, the Jeep became the coin of the realm, and every coin had a story scratched into it with a screwdriver. The captured Jeep's journey through the North African black market is the story of how a humble design bent an entire theater's logic towards speed, serviceability, and improvisation. It turned scarcity into a trade, turned mechanics into strategists, and turned the enemy's simplicity into a shared survival kit that crossed uniforms and languages. Official records recognized Beutefahrzeug, but the archives cannot fully measure how many messages arrived, how many wounds were spared, infection, or how many men got one more dawn because a condenser traded hands at midnight. In narrative terms, the Jeep is an emblem, but in the sand, it was an argument that won itself, standard parts, forgiving tolerances, and a maintainable architecture beat elegance that demanded permission. The Kübelwagen, admirable in its own right, represents what specialization can achieve under ideal conditions. The Jeep represents what generalism can rescue when conditions are anything but. That black market wasn't criminal so much as adaptive. It was war learning in real time. One wrench turn ahead of disaster. And for WW2 Whispers, the microhistory matters because it reveals the quiet slope beneath big numbers. Mass production created availability, availability enabled standardization, and standardization birthed invisible economies that converted captured metal into living time. If victory is the sum of small, timely advantages, then every Beuter Jeep that started at 030 Dow added its fraction, paid for in favors and risk, and banked as miles unspooled under stars. Long after the desert cooled, the lesson remained hot to the touch. Design for the hands that will save lives in the dark, and the market, official or otherwise, will do the rest.